Okay? So in this sound studio, we have future Dr. Dre's, we have future other types of sound engineers. In this room, we have people who've won Brave New Voices Poetry Slam by creating their own spoken word videos. We have many STEM-like pedagogical experiences happening, but in a non-classroom, non-traditional classroom space. Okay? Hip-hop pedagogy can afford students that. And you think beyond the modest constructs of achievement and think about where the students are actually coming from. Okay? Classroom or not?
Yes.
Classroom. This is a group of, many of these students are 4.0 students. They're in the after-school program at the Boys and Girls Club that Adisa, my partner with Hip Hop Chess, and I run in the summertime. And we were talking about the rules of castling that day. And we're teaching them about a move called the poison pawn. And the poison pawn is a move essentially, for those of you who aren't necessarily chess aficionados, but it's a move where you take the pawn, which is in a very positivist or capitalistic way, because it doesn't get you the most points on the board, the least important piece on the chessboard, okay? But not necessary. So in the poison pawn, we tell the students that, okay, so you're going to have your opponent chase your pawn around the board, and when you get them to a certain block on the board, you can come around with your queen and take their king. Now, when we're talking about intersectionality, and we're talking about patriarchy, and we're talking about capitalism, how many times I've heard, my queen? Why would I use my queen? Why don't I use my king? Because your king has to stay. Your king can't do as much. They don't want to use their queens. They're too proud. When we're talking about capitalism, why can't I just use the most powerful piece? Why am I using the pawn? We use that to teach them about Enron. We use that to teach them to start their own stock portfolios. This was a bedrock of so many other conversations around market-based theologies, around positivist thinking, inductive reasoning. All we did was start with one move as an icebreaker that day, the poison pawn. Okay, so the poison pawn just got them hooked. And then we have our students journal to debrief. One of our students is a big fan of the show The Wire, and was talking about the corner boys in the show The Wire, and talking about how the corner boys were the pawns, and the school to prison pipeline, and many of his friends from this community were corner boys who were just trying to help put food on the table. But he wrote, if the government really wanted to do something about school to prison, they go after the cartels. Why is it the corner boys or the pawns are the ones that are taking the rap for? And I'm paraphrasing a 15-year-old's journal entry. But he got it on a level that was far more as intersectional as anything Kimberly Crenshaw has ever written. So, hip-hop chess as pedagogy, hip-hop as pedagogy, intersectional thinking, intersectional teaching. Classroom or not? Absolutely a classroom. Traditional. Okay.
Not traditional.
Oh, not traditional.
Obviously, but a classroom for sure.
You know, I want to touch on. Can you, if you don't mind, what's your name?
Carrie.
Carrie. If you don't mind sharing why you would say that's not a traditional classroom.
Well, obviously, it's not in rows and whatnot, but it's certainly a classroom because you learn through experience and exploration, discovery learning.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And the reason why I'm asking is not to pick on you, by the way, because if every anecdote had me, I would look very narcissistic. So thank you, Carrie. The reason why I find it a little paradoxical that Carrie said this is a non-traditional, now to us, Westerners, this is non-traditional classroom. However, this is a photograph of Al-Kauai University, which is the first degree-granting university on the face of the earth, according to the Guinness Book of World Records. It was started by an African woman in the year 859. By a person of color, a woman in the year 859 in Africa. And I see some people looking at me like, yeah, right? I've been trying to tell them. It's microaggression. No, I feel whoever's nodding right now, I don't want to put you all black. I feel you. And her name is Fatima Al-Fahiri, is the name of the Moroccan woman who started this university. By the way, this university is very prestigious in Morocco, and to this day still produces some of the world's best engineers, STEM scholars in Africa. Okay? Still grants degrees. It's the oldest degree granting institution on planet Earth.
What year again?
859.
859.
Yes, ma'am. Classroom. Classroom. We change the constructs of achievement in order to align with those we purport to serve. Because unless you do that, it's a fallacy. So speaking of fallacies, we're gonna get to that in a moment, but let's talk about implicit bias. This idea that as first generation people ourselves, how many of you were in TRIO yourselves? We're TRIO alumni, okay. How many of you were not, but you're first generation college now at some point? Okay, that's the majority of this room. We have our own biases of what constitutes a high achiever or a high achieving student. Based on what? Our own experiences or the closest point of reference that we can pull from. So for that young child that Dr. Love showed us the video of, if his father or someone I assume to be his father in that video is his closest cue, the next time he's in a cipher and someone doesn't behave similarly to his father, he may be recluse and he may not jump in. And someone may make the erroneous assumption that he's never been in a cipher before. These are the same erroneous assumptions that our counterparts at our schools, and even ourselves, I'm sad to admit, sometimes ascribe to as a result of no fault of our own, but our own experiences. But by being aware of these biases, we can help deconstruct them. So one thing I want to point out, I'm not going to read the slide to you, but is that we generally tend to hold implicit biases that favor our own in-group. 52%, according to my literature review for my dissertation, 52% of our public school students are first generation, and of those first generation students, 60% are students of color. 80% of public school teachers and counselors are white, women from middle to upper class communities. So again, I'm not saying those three variables as a pejorative. I'm saying them as keep in mind the points of reference in upbringing for the teachers and counselors versus the students who are actually in the schools are diametrically different in many cases from a social capital standpoint in terms of the experiences and social privileges that they were afforded. And so when you engage that student, through no fault of your own, you may assume that a student is, like with the young man, not interested or hasn't had experience with a cipher. No, just not one that looks like this. So, implicit bias and pedagogy. Okay? Now, in my research, I'm looking at two things. So, just to share, I helped with I was director, before I came to Skyline as a professor, and now as a dean, I was director of community programs for the San Francisco Unified School District. And I worked with the associate superintendent of support programs. And in that community, when I started there in 2010, first generation African American Black diasporic students represented 9% of our populace. Okay, and that was like in the middle throes of gentrification, so it's a little less now. But at that point, it was 9%. Okay? Our 9% represented 77% of our suspensions and expulsions from our schools in San Francisco. So our superintendent, himself an ETS grad, and a person of color, a Chicano man, came to me and was like, yeah, I'm new, Arash, you're new, I can tell you're about social justice, let's do something about this. Go. Here's a grant, here's some money, I'll give you some staff, do your thing. And it's kind of like someone asked me to summarize Big Bang Theory in 3 words or less. Like, oh, okay. Well, first of all, dot, and then, like, that's not really how it works, bro. Like, can we have a conversation? So, it was difficult. It was difficult. But one thing that culminated from that venture were restorative justice programs at 2 high schools that I was in charge of delivering categorical programs like TRIO. We actually hooked up with Upper Bound at USF, University of San Francisco, which is still happening today. And we created a restorative justice program for our students that were unduly, in most cases, being referred for suspension and expulsion, which is still a vestige that's happening today. If any of you paid attention to the news 2 days ago, a young man brought a clock, and now he's a terrorist, because it had a time limit, and some factors around his identity, but that didn't matter. So, I'm being facetious for those of you who want to I'm the dude that, like, substitute teacher day, I was like, bro, don't try, that's me, that's me, that's me. Like, when I go through TSA, I know to shave, like, I'm like, oh, here comes the random. It's hot for us right now, that's my point. So what we found is in these 2 schools, and my dissertation is a case study of 2 different schools. One school in San Francisco and one school in East Oakland, which is about 2 blocks away from the college that I'm the dean of. So those schools have very different policies around restorative justice. And we'll talk about that in a second. But how many of you have actually heard of restorative justice? Oh, quite a few of you, so good. I don't have to give as much bedrock. So Russell Skiba, who is a professor at, I believe, Indiana University, where they're very much entrenched in school-to-prison research. A lot of his work is on the Civil Rights Project website for UCLA as well. They cite him quite a bit with Gary Orfield and some other folks. But he found in 2002 that the subjectivity, the implicit bias between counselors and teachers were very much aligned depending on the race, gender, and class of students. So what I mean by that is the same thing that I may get a slap on the wrist for, Dr. Love may get an expulsion for. Okay? And so these findings were done over and over again across communities, across schools, across types of age groups, so from secondary to elementary, high school, even community college where I work now. And they were almost congruent in terms of just general findings. And I would say the disproportionate stratification of suspensions and discipline. So what we discussed with the superintendent and I, or the associate superintendent and I, was how restorative justice programs could possibly lower teacher bias or arbitrary reasons for suspension. Okay? Now here's the catch. In order for the bias to be lowered, you can't wait for someone to get in trouble. I can't wait for Carrie to say something, what I would say rude to me. I see you pursing your lips. I'm not really talking. No. I'm just teasing. But, and then say, oh, well, I think she's being rude. She must not get me, and then suspend her. Because that really does waste a lot of human potential around building rapport with Carrie. Building that relationship that's so germane to the TRIO experience as well as the traditional classroom experience for our students, right? And I'm sure, as I have heard in my years as not only an Upper Bound alumnus, as well as an assistant with Upper Bound and at SSS, so many of my students would come up to me and say, Mr. D, you're like my school counselors don't have the same relationship as me and you, and they see me more than you see. Why is that? They don't even know why. And I don't think it's just because I'm a TRIO alumnus. I think it's because I take the time to listen. And listening has a lot more to do with just being quiet, because sometimes you're quiet, but you're only quiet because you're waiting for your turn to talk, right? So, ecological systems theory. So how do we get past the implicit bias and create a restorative justice program or scaffold or restorative justice curricula that's steeped in cultural literacy, or what for our students would be, in many cases, hip-hop pedagogy. That is considering an entire macro system beyond the classroom where, let's say, a student acts out. That would be a support network for this student. Now, what I have found in my doctoral research is the restorative justice program at Mission High School and John O'Connell High School in the Mission in San Francisco, where I worked, And the program that I'm studying, where I actually have video from YouTube that I actually shot of footage of the students I interviewed for my dissertation, of a more holistic restorative justice program, the outcomes are similar in that they lowered the suspension rates, but different by a different rate. And also, I would say as a result of the fact that we didn't wait for students to rear their heads as problematic or at risk, a term that I find reprehensible. In the same way that Dr. Love talked about achievement gaps. Because in the same way our students may not have materialistic opportunities to achieve, they also don't have material opportunities to be heard. So ecological systems theory is from Bronfenbrenner, and it was cited in 2009 by Burke and Roberts. A lot older when Bronfenbrenner came up with it. I don't have that year right now, so I'm sorry. But it's this idea that when you're creating a restorative justice program, in order to capture the cultural capital of a student, you have to capture every element of culture. So what does that mean? That means everything. So our students, when they're in trouble with their counselors, or maybe even in trio, you may pull them out of a Saturday session and you may talk to them one-on-one, but when a restorative justice hip-hop pedagogy lens, that fails to consider the conditioning around the outcome. So you need to bring the conditioning into the mold or the fold of the conversation. That means parents, so be it. If that means you bring in an artist that they look up to in their local community, Dr. Love mentioned that can connect with them, you make that effort. If that means you bring their pastors, you do that. If that means you bring their basketball coaches, you do that. Because all of these people, these variables, are steeped or fused within culture. And so, from an ecological systems theory, you can't blame the duck for swimming in mud if you're not willing to do something about the water. You can't say those lyrics are misogynistic, problematic, Cornel West would call it nihilistic, self-hating, if you're not willing to ask, well, we don't own any of these record labels, so how do you think these lyrics made their way to mainstream? Don't worry, I'll wait. Because we're not the ones that paid for these lyrics to end up on the mainstream radio station. So rather than blaming the MCs, who are also culpable, but not unilaterally, you have to think from an ecological systems theory, you have to think about the entire culture of achievement in the same way that you think about the entire culture of hip-hop and also hip-hop as a business. So that brings me to the next theory that influenced our learning community at Skyline, as well as restorative justice programs in Oakland and San Francisco. That is Tara Yoso's a theory of community cultural wealth. There's 6 community cultural wealth types of capital that students all bring with them, that when you're asking yourself, where do I start? Right? I just mentioned a few people arbitrarily that you may want to talk to. You want to make sure that if you're creating a restorative justice program, that you capture, or for your school, or for your nonprofit, or for your trio program, you capture each of these 6 elements. Aspirational capital. Someone that is, from a background standpoint, aligned with the background of your students who've gotten to where your students aspire to be. Familial capital. You may not understand something about a student because you don't know what's going on at home or who they consider to be family. Dr. Love is family. I know to many of you, we talk about relatives, blood relatives, then we got fam. That's my fam. So if someone's coming to me and asking me who are your influences, I'm not just going to talk about my mom. I'm going to talk about my big sister too. Right? So you have to think about family beyond the traditional lens of what family actually means. Social capital. I think that one is self-explanatory at this point. Linguistic capital. We talked about Facebooking, Googling, chairing your committee. What language looks like. Pac versus Shakespeare. We talked about that. Resistance capital. When students resist, are they being impertinent, petulant brats? Or are they exercising their voice? Are they thinking about self-defense? If I'm being marginalized because you keep speaking over me, I may be quiet or I may get louder. And if I'm doing that, you have to think first about where this resistance is coming from and where that modus operandi of being louder, where that is taught. So you can think about it in context of the student rather than just vilifying and dismissing. Navigational capital. Navigational capital is far less complicated than it sounds, but it can be complicated depending on how intersectional a student's capital is with regards to where they want to be and where you would like them to be. So when you're thinking about a first-gen low-income student in SSS who had a 3.0 when you accepted them in your program, but now they have a 1.9, and that steep decline is resulting in their potential dismissal from your program. You may want to think about how they got there before you think about the absolute number in of itself. Okay? Oftentimes we start with the number, and the secondary part is the conversation, rather than the conversation of how we got there. So what I call, this is just a picture that I think embodies everything. The cultural iceberg is a term I just made up. So it's this idea that we're looking at their classes, and at the top it got cut off because I did this on a Mac, but here it's just their classes that they're taking in your program, things they have to subscribe to in order to be deemed qualified for the scholarship your program might give. We gave a scholarship for students that participate in various things in SSS, or to have a GPA in your various colleges and schools. They need that. So that's part of the culture of that school. In Kendesi, students have to take reading and writing and math and science and all that. But you have to think about beyond the class, there's a way of introducing it, and that's the deep culture. So if we're only worried about the class itself, sometimes we are dismissing the fact that these classes are not to be taught in one way. They're to be taught in the way that's the best fit for the student. Okay? And that's the cultural iceberg. Now we get to the students that we want to reach through that deep culture form of pedagogy. This picture, what's wrong with it? I'll let you go. Everything. No doubt. Is it triggering? It's triggering for me every time I see it. So this is a real photo, by the way. This is not staged. This is a young man in Oakland who he was, from what I did some research about this picture, he was at the apparent, evidently, he and some of his friends were throwing garbage on the highway. Rather than asking, why is this young man near the freeway?
Yeah.
We're not talking about that. We're talking about the garbage.
Now, when you say young man, that's a child.
Looks like he's
I mean, I'm
You're
trying
right.
to see if it's just a short, older guy, or if this is a
Duly
child.
noted.
Because
It is a
to
child.
describe him as a young man is also.
And that's just my own
psychologically
conditioning because I work with youth, and so I want them to think of themselves as budding scholars. But thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah,
I
I had
appreciate
to
it.
call you on that.
No, I appreciate it.
No, I'm only.
It's being recorded, so
Yeah.
it's all good. This child was arrested and booked on charges of littering near the freeway, rather than thinking about the conditions, the ecological system that led to that outcome. Rather than thinking about how this scholar got to the 1.9, we're thinking about the 1.9. And so the 1.9 somehow supersedes the human being, right? To your point. And that's problematic for all of us, yes?
Yeah.
In San Francisco and the rest of the country, for every one white student controlled for first generation status, by the way. So white first gen versus black first gen. They receive an out of school suspension, 3 black students receive an out of school suspension. So we're controlling for factors here. Even then, there's implicit bias going on. So now we're getting to the social distance theory of power, which is aligned with the statistic that I threw out earlier about the majority of public school teachers being from a social class that's outside of the realm of those that they're serving. And so that social distancing does create barriers in some cases and challenges, if anything, around communication in the classroom. Communication around achievement, and also, by extension, the criminalization of students who don't achieve based on someone else's metrics, to borrow from Dr. Love. So this asymmetric relationship has profound and deleterious outcomes on students who are susceptible to kind of deferring to someone else's authority because they've been conditioned that way. So what that outcome looks like is also fiscal. It's also market-based. So in California, for every student that we spend $7,463 on in the public school system, and I'm from Cali, but you can look this up in the Office of Civil Rights website. They have a chart for every state. We spend almost 50 grand on what they call, and this is a disgusting term, pre-inmate, which just means an incarcerated youth. Which does tacitly imply that you're assuming they're going to be adult inmates. You know where they're going, but you're not willing to step in. That's a problem. 50 grand versus 7 grand. That's the problem. Again, constructs are superseding the humanistic aspect of achievement. So there's 3 fallacies of justice that we need to dismantle. So just that now, I'm kind of oscillating here, just to bring it all back. And I borrowed from Clint Smith, who's a researcher at Harvard. So these are from him. 3 fallacies of justice that Dr. Smith says keep us from creating more programs like Hip Hop Ed. That is this idea that Dr. Love touched on, that justice or education or injustice is ahistorical. That through time and enough hours, right? A lot of schools, it's avant-garde right now for school districts to extend the amount of hours students spend at school. That if you just spend enough time around these other students or bust them into the right school, they will somehow, by osmosis, learn how to achieve. Like Dr. Love said, I made it this far.
Yeah.
The Great Pyramids, we didn't have lasers. Y'all sucked. They're over. Right? Like a bag of toenail clippings. That thing fell over. Man, so ahistorical fallacy. We have to get past time being a critical factor and think more about the conditioning involved with that time. Second fallacy, this idea of policy, or as many people call people like Ben Carson, respectability politics. If we just pass the right policy, people will act right. We just have to hold them accountable. You just got to do this to people. I'm sorry, bro. But you just got to you got to be a servant. You got to let people know who's in charge. Pass the right policy, hold the right people accountable, zero tolerance. And they'll shape up. Okay, so I'd like to migrate your attention to Brown versus Board, 1954.
Thank you.
And the rest is history. Our schools are now just as segregated. Philadelphia, they did a study last year in the Office of Civil Rights, is just as segregated in terms of concentration of black versus white public school districts as it was pre-Brown versus Board in Philly. Chicago, Oakland, they're coming up too. The final fallacy that Dr. Smith denotes is the great leader. I put it in quotes because he actually called it the great man theory. I didn't want to call it the great man theory because there's plenty of, in terms of implicit bias we talked about, you don't have to look like the devil to proliferate the devil's way of thinking. You can be a woman and do it. You can be a person of color and do it. You can be a first-gen person and do it. You can be a first-generation person and say, I don't want my son or daughter to go to school with other first-gen students because they'll pick up bad habits. How many of you have heard that? I have. I hear that all the time. In Oakland, by people who grew up in Oakland. And I'm just looking at them like, they still thank you? Like, oh, okay. So great leader theory. Elect the right person. He or she will save us. Save us? We all read Blindside now? Like, really? That's what it is? I need someone with a adorably patterned sweater vest to come to my school and save me? Sorry, or freedom riders, or any of these tropes. This fixation on rulers rather than the conditioning of their rules. Criminalization of normative adolescent behavior. So this is directly from my dissertation in my book, How Whiteness Stole Justice. This research was done in Oakland, and I controlled for first-gen low-income status based on actually our TRIO data, again, around who qualifies for our TRIO programs. And when I controlled for those two variables, the only other variable was race and ethnicity. And so I looked at, my research is on black students, male or female. I was just looking at black students. And I just did disaggregate somewhat for gender, but I don't have that data yet because I'm in the process of doing that. But what I found that when and this includes college campuses, by the way, when you're writing a referral up, the same incident, there's implicit bias that influences the narrative, depending on that narrative. We're talking about linguistic capital, right? It's okay for someone to say, chair my committee, but it's not okay for someone else to say that. You're going to correct the other person, right? So pushing and shoving for one demographic of students is known as battery for another. Swiping headphones is known as theft or robbery. Nah, man, I'll give it back. I just want to hear that song. But that's theft or robbery. I'm not excusing it. But there's a lot of contextual factors that go in that are completely omitted from the reports. Talking back. Disorderly conduct. I'm not saying that some folks need to learn the time and space of when to get turnt, if you will. But disorderly conduct? Really? What do these sound like to you? Where else do you see these on a daily basis? Someone said news. Yes, on the evening news with referencing adult inmates. So now you're seeing the connection. You're seeing the constellation of factors all coming together. We are implicitly conditioning the ecological system, that proverbial mud that duck is swimming or can't swim in, that we're blaming the duck for. We're conditioning it, but we're blaming the